are coming in, do you know if there's a way to see a timer? Because with my presentation up, I don't have a clock.
That is an excellent question. I am not aware of that.
Okay,
We can
I will.
try.
I will use my watch, and my phone is here, so I'll.
Okay. On my computer, I don't know if you have a Mac or not. On my computer, when I
Mm.
show a presentation in Zoom, I have the timer on my other screen, but I have two screens. So
Yeah, so I have two screens too, and I have a PC, and it for some reason goes away. So that's okay though. We'll make it work.
okay, super. Thanks, everyone. We see lots of folks are introducing themselves in the chat. And if you came in after we made that announcement, if you can use the chat at the bottom of your screen to introduce who you are and your organization and where you are, that would be fantastic. All right, let me do an introduction to our speaker and to this event. My name is Chris Stepanuk, and along with my colleague Ashley Eaton, this is the last of a series of webinars that we've hosted this year as part of a stormwater education methods course at the University of Vermont. And we are pleased today to be focused on stormwater as related to green stormwater infrastructure as a social justice tool. We have Lisa Merrifield with us, who's a sustainable community specialist with the University of Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development team. She's more than 20 years of experience working to build sustainability in Illinois and around the Great Lakes. And she holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a master's in urban planning with a focus on natural resource planning. And she's going to be speaking to us today about a project that was done partially during COVID even this year surrounding the ideas related to green infrastructure and social justice. And we will, after she speaks, we'll have opportunity for you all to ask questions and engage in back and forth conversation as well. And again, if those folks who are maybe interested in a certificate of completion, just drop an email to us or put it in the chat, and we can save the chat at the end to make sure we get folks those certificates at the end of today. So I will turn it over to Lisa.
All right, thanks so much. And thanks for having me. I'm happy to be your final speaker in this series and talking about what was really a cool project looking at green infrastructure and social justice. Whoops, let me see if I can. There we go. Before I begin, I do want to do a land acknowledgement, and I'd like to recognize and acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piakasha, Wea, Miami, Muscootin, Ottawa, Sauk, Muscogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Obijaywa, and Kikasha. These lands were the traditional territories of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the story of these nations and the struggle for survival and identity. As the land-grant institution at the University of Illinois, we have a particular responsibility to acknowledge these people and these lands, as well as the history of dispossession that has allowed for the growth of this institution for the last 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on the activities addressed in these histories and the roles the university has played in those. This acknowledgement and the centering of the Native people is just a start moving forward over the next 150 years. All right, so today we're going to talk about, give you some backgrounds. We're going to talk a little bit about structural racism and environmental justice. I think this is a nice time to have that conversation because I think we're all, this is in the forefront of our consciousness in a way that it might not have been had we been having this conversation a year ago. So we'll just kind of touch on those concepts and how those concepts have really impacted communities of color and communities with different socioeconomic availability. Then we'll dive in and talk about what really are the co-benefits of green infrastructure, and what, we talk a lot about stormwater and we talk a lot about how beautiful green infrastructure is, but there is so much more to green infrastructure and so much more potential for benefit. That said, there's also the possibility for some unintended consequences. So I will talk a little bit about those. And then finally, I will end up talking about the study that we just did looking at equitable green infrastructure in the North Central region. So that's my plan. Um, any thoughts or comments before we get started? I'm trying to glance at the chat too. All right. So structural racism, you have likely seen this picture before. We know with all that's been in the news lately that many of us come from a place of privilege without really even recognizing we are in that place of privilege, and that that we now know, or our eyes have been opened in new ways to the fact that um, because we have that privilege, we have an obligation to help those who historically have been marginalized or in many ways not given access to that, um, to the necessary resources to even have equality or equity. Um, I like this picture because it shows reality that that many of us are just leagues ahead of many others by nothing we really did, but just by the way society is designed. Um, and we talk about equality, which means we're all equal, but with many of us so far ahead to begin with, equality doesn't really solve the problem. We talk about equity in terms of making sure that no matter where we start, we're all um, at a similar place and have similar access to resources. And then I like this because it goes on to talk about liberation, just removing the barriers for all of us, making sure no matter how we come to the table, we all have access to the resources we need. So um, environmental justice is a flavor um, and certainly has roots in that structural racism. Um, there was a study that came out, I think in 2018, and I should have written down um, the author and the citation, but it looked at cities, particularly in the Midwest, small to medium-sized cities, and the prevalence of structural racism. So it comes out of that historic racism, the redlining and whatnot, but particularly in smaller communities, small to mid-sized communities, it's really difficult to break that down, even if the current administrations in those cities have absolutely no interest or no desire to perpetuate structural racism. Uh, the fact that those cities have limited budgets and staff sizes that don't let people necessarily specialize in the ways that they need to, so those kinds of things just perpetuate, and environmental justice um, shows up in those areas. We see amenities, we see infrastructure in more affluent parts of communities more so than we do in less affluent parts of communities, um, in part just because of the history of those places. So EPA defines environmental justice as fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. To take it a step further, Robert Bullard is often thought of as the father of environmental justice, and he talks about why the status quo isn't good enough. That if we continue to use the planning tools of the past, then we continue that historic structural racism. We continue to put resources into the already upgraded parts of communities because it's easier, and we continue to neglect those often communities of color and communities with lower house values that require more work and more attention and are just harder places to address. So so I think it's helpful to kind of think about in those terms that that this is a really gnarly problem, and there's not easy solutions to it. So so our goal is ultimately with the idea of environmental justice to make sure that communities can be resilient in the face of a variety of challenges. I know in Illinois, the models are saying that we are going to have more rain rather than less. Some parts of the Midwest will have less rain. The Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota will likely have less rain, but we're going to have more. And so that means increased flooding and increased stormwater issues and increased need for green infrastructure. So what does all this have to do with green infrastructure? So when we look at green infrastructure, there are lots of benefits of green infrastructure. This is from a publication from the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which operates out of Chicago, and is just a fantastic nonprofit working with stormwater issues. And they built this table looking at the variety of things that green infrastructure can do to help a community, help an area. I think largely, let me get a pointer. If I can find it. Oh, maybe not.
You might be able to move your mouse and we may be able to see your,
Can you see my mouse? You can see it?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. That makes it easier. So when we talk about green infrastructure, or when I talk to communities talking about green infrastructure, they really focus on this stormwater aspect. A lot of times it's public work departments or it's engineers who are looking at green infrastructure. And so they're missing a whole world out here of opportunities and of benefits that green infrastructure can have. Oop. Now I have to go back. There we go. One of the things that green infrastructure can really do for communities of color, challenged communities, is reduce the need for energy, reduce energy use. And we know that that people in poverty, energy is a huge cost, and sometimes they have to make trade-offs between, staying warm or cool and eating. And so if green infrastructure installations can help reduce those energy costs for people, that's a huge benefit. Green infrastructure can also improve local air quality. And again, that's people living in those underserved and challenged communities often live closer to industrial facilities or things that make their local air quality not as abundant and not as nice as it should be. And so that's a benefit that green infrastructure can have and can produce for people. Green infrastructure also reduces the urban heat island effect, and that is, if any of you are familiar with that concept, it's the idea that cities create their own heat. And so places with lots of concrete and lots of infrastructure, lots of buildings, don't cool off as much at night. And there's research to indicate that if temperatures don't drop below a certain level at night, for people who live in poverty, that increases their death rate because they can't cool off. And that's a huge problem. So the fact that green infrastructure can help reduce those urban heat islands, I think is something that we can utilize. Green infrastructure improves aesthetics. It makes neighborhoods more beautiful. And again, if you're living in poverty, beauty may not be something that you're used to seeing. It may be a lot of concrete. It may be a lot of dirt. And so having those improved aesthetics and having neighborhoods be more attractive is a benefit. And green infrastructure can also increase recreational opportunities. It can often look like parks or places to walk or places to gather as a community outside. There's a faculty member here named Ming Kuo who does research on the psychological benefits for children of having green spaces close to their homes and places where they can be outside and play. And her research is just incredibly telling that having those green spaces and having access to those places really helps kids educationally. It helps their attention span. There's a real correlation between nature and children. Again, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know with that, but that is something that green infrastructure can contribute to communities if it is equitably distributed. A green infrastructure can also reduce noise pollution, which again, if you're living in a community that's closer to industrial facilities or closer to roadways, might be a really significant benefit to increase that livability. Green infrastructure can also improve community cohesion, and this is a huge area, a really fascinating area. Communities that are more cohesive tend to have lower crime rates. People have lower stress levels because there's less loneliness, and so that the ability to create community cohesion is really incredibly important when we're looking at underserved communities. Making sure that people can come together in spaces and have pride in their community. And in a lot of cases, green infrastructure can provide opportunities for them to help care for some of those spaces. So that's a huge benefit, hard to quantify sometimes, but one not to discount. Urban agriculture is another possibility with green infrastructure. Sometimes on green roofs, you can have tomatoes and other vegetables that that these communities might be disconnected from. They might not have a local grocery store that provides produce. In cities in particular, we talk about food deserts, and green infrastructure has the possibility, at least, to provide some of those resources. And then finally, green infrastructure can provide public education opportunities, ways for people to come together and to learn and to be together and to increase their understanding of the natural world and of their neighbors. And I said finally, but I lied. The final thing I wanted to add on to here is a workforce development component. And I think this is really interesting, and we're just scratching the surface on the workforce development potential of green infrastructure. But it seems to me that that cities often and planners often think about or are scared off by green infrastructure because it needs to be maintained differently. You need people who at least have some skills to maintain green infrastructure. That is not the case if you are maintaining gray infrastructure, where you're laying pipes under the ground, but a garden has to be tended throughout the growing season. So green infrastructure really provides an interesting opportunity for workforce development and workforce training programs. And I think, might be an under appreciated quality of green infrastructure as cities are starting to think about implementing it. So really, green infrastructure employs people rather than just laying down pipe. And I think that's an incredible opportunity. But there are some caveats to this. So green infrastructure has been linked to gentrification, and there have been many epic green infrastructure failures, if you will, around the country. The headline I've got up here is on the 606, which is in Chicago. And this was an old railway line. And the city went in and built this beautiful walking path, and there are gardens along the sides, and it's really lovely. The problem is that this old railroad line was lined by low-income housing. Housing that people, that people who couldn't afford more would live in. And when this trail went in, what we see over and over again is that these beautiful amenities that are designed to help the people who live there um, end up drawing speculative real estate. So investors come in and buy these buildings and then renovate them, and then the rent goes up. And this is a really hard problem to solve um, because it's hard. In our society, we don't want to say, building owner, building owner Joe, you can't sell your building to this developer if they're going to, pay you twice what it used to be worth. And in Chicago, one of the things that happens is that if you have less, I believe it's less than 8 units in a building, that you don't have to have a portion of that be reserved for low-income housing, for people who are unsubsidized housing. So what developers did, not all of them, but what happened in some cases is developers would come in, they would buy buildings, they would build huge luxury apartments so that they were under that requirement, and then turn around and sell them. Sell them to people who were like, well, I could live along this lovely walkway and have this beautiful brand new apartment. And so it displaced people. And as I say, it's a really hard problem to solve. So in terms of what green infrastructure does to housing prices, there are a number of studies and there's a range. I've seen from a 17% housing increase to a 26% housing increase. And it probably goes even higher than that. It depends on some things we'll talk about in just a second, but that's enough that it can displace people who are on, very fixed incomes. Any of us, if, no matter, well, okay, very wealthy people probably can handle a 25% increase in their rent or their mortgage payment, but most of us can't. For most of us, we're living right where we can live. So there was a study done in 2019 that looked at what factors really went into raising the prices. When did we see housing prices raise and gentrification occurring with green infrastructure installations, and when did we not? And this was a little broader than just our stormwater green infrastructure. This was parks, and this was trails and things like that. But what they really found is that green infrastructure that was put in place and provided some transportation corridors, so bike paths or walking paths, that increased housing prices. And then anything that made a neighborhood, gave a neighborhood increased proximity to downtown or business districts was also problematic in terms of making sure that green infrastructure really served the local community and didn't disenfranchise people. Interestingly, in this research, the size of a park was less connected to an increase in price. So there's somebody out of I'm gonna lose it. Cleveland Botanic Gardens, who's written a book called Vacant to Vibrant. And she looked at and helped facilitate building green infrastructure, tearing down abandoned housing and building green infrastructure sites in those communities. So doing things like that doesn't necessarily increase the property values and doesn't necessarily displace people, but it does help with all those other things we talked about, the community cohesion and the aesthetics and bringing people together and getting kids outdoors. So to build a fairly big green infrastructure site, so long as you don't connect it to anything. Is that fair? I don't know, but it's something to think about. And, as communities are thinking about how to implement green infrastructure renovations, making sure and building a good plan to make sure that people aren't disenfranchised, that you're really helping the people you're trying to help. So these are just some things to think about. If this is an area of interest in particular, I really recommend that you read some of the work of Winifred Curran. She's out of DePaul University in Chicago, and she's written a book called Just Green Enough. So she's done a lot of research into to where this boundary is, how we make sure that we provide environmental benefit to communities um, without displacing the current residents, without just moving the problem somewhere else. Um, and she's just done a lot of really interesting work in this. This picture is from a nature walk in Brooklyn and is related to this article that I have pulled up here, the 5 Angry Women to Kick-Ass Community. And this was basically an area that flooded and there was a lot of water quality issues. And so the city needed to do something. And the community really came together to do their best to make sure they solved the problem and they benefited from the solution, but that it didn't draw the speculative real estate and it didn't disenfranchise the people who were there. So it's a nice example of how we can engage communities and bring people together to solve multiple problems, including social justice issues. Okay. So now let's get on to the study that we conducted in 2019 and 2020. So this idea looking at green infrastructure in terms of equity was of course not mine alone. I'd been reading about it, and the NGICP, the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program from the National Water Federation had come out, and so we were looking at and starting to talk about green jobs and what that means, and you know how we develop this workforce development tool. And I was at a meeting, the North Central Region Water Network One Water meeting, and there was a session on social justice and water, and I kind of perhaps co-opted the conversation because I was so interested in like, how does this work? How do you make sure that that equity is really included in these social justice or in these green infrastructure projects? And so from that, a group of us got together and we received some funding from the North Central Region Water Network to do a look. So this was kind of our model. You know, we have green infrastructure, we have social justice, we have workforce development. Kind of at the center of that is an opportunity that it seems like was available, particularly as we know more and more communities are turning to green infrastructure as a solution to stormwater. Is there an opportunity for us to help them? And of course, I'm coming from an extension perspective. I've got a lot of Sea Grant colleagues. So this is the kind of the sweet spot we're interested in. How do we help those communities really do the good work they want to do in this space? So the project team consisted of folks from Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And this is a map of the states that we were looking at as we looked at this work. Our goals were really to inform extension and possibly Sea Grant work around how it is we help communities engage in some of these co-benefits as we are helping communities figure out what to build and where. So we wanted some prioritizations. We wanted to see what research gaps were out there. We wanted to understand barriers. And we wanted to find like how do we fund stuff like this? How do we help communities fund things like this? So that was our overarching goal. We started out by looking at kind of what the network looked like, who out there in the extension world was working on these kinds of things and interested in this area. What kind of policies were in place in the states we were looking at, both for green infrastructure and as green infrastructure or water connects to social justice issues. And then we did kind of a scan of communities that have green infrastructure programs and what do those look like. We took all that and we did some key informant listening sessions. And then we came together and we held a synthesis summit to bring all we learned together and kind of help us identify some of those priorities. So this is kind of, there's a lot on this, but this was our first look at, what do the state policies look like in terms of green infrastructure, and are there any connections right now? Are any states doing anything that helps kind of bridge those gaps with those co-benefits? And basically what we found is that states are investing from basically nothing to hundreds of millions of dollars in green infrastructure efforts around the region. In their NPDES permits, which is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, which some cities are subject to and gives them access to increase funds or funds available that can go towards green infrastructure. What do those permits require about green infrastructure? And we found that many states made no reference to green infrastructure. You can deal with your stormwater discharge any way you choose, and there's not a preference. Some said, well, we prefer you use green infrastructure, but use what you need to. Others went further and said you need more education. So there was a range. Interestingly, the range, what was in the NPDES permits correlated fairly closely to the number of green infrastructure sites and the amount of money states were spending on those sites. So states that had some kind of green infrastructure preference or language in the NPDES permit it was showing up as more green infrastructure ending up in the cities. We looked at funding opportunities, and there were various grants and loan programs depending on the state. And then we also looked at stormwater utilities, because stormwater utilities are often used as a way to fund green infrastructure projects. And so we thought, looking at that would be informative of where there might be financial resources available. So then we decided where we were going to do our key informant listening sessions, and we wanted we wanted to represent our entire region if possible. We wanted to talk to people in cities of varying size and of varying stages of maturity. So we didn't want to talk to only cities who had got an established equity green infrastructure program, but we wanted to talk to those who were just starting a green infrastructure program in their city, or just starting to think about this. So we looked at a wide variety. So as we were picking locations, we tried to make sure we had representation from various sized places and various stages in the process. Our goal was to do 2 listening sessions in each state. As you can see from the orange dots on the map, we didn't make that. Which was largely, well, 2 factors. We needed a champion in the state. We needed, primarily we were looking at extension agents. So we needed somebody who could help us pull the pieces together. And we also ran into COVID, which slowed us down and made it harder for us to visit locations and kind of pull some of that together. But we ended up with 18 listening sessions around the region, and I think a pretty good, initial data set on what people are thinking and how people are approaching green infrastructure in terms of an equity lens. So, as I mentioned, most of our listening sessions had to be remote. We got a few of them in before we started to shut down. But as you know, our plan was to do listening sessions from January through April of 2020, and we knew by February that we were going to have a problem, or we suspected that we were going to have a problem. So we slowed things down and we went remote. And as I say, that largely worked. It was nice because a lot of my budget was to travel, and so we had money to do other things, which was fantastic. So in terms of our format, we had 1 to 5 participants. We talked to people who could talk at a larger level. So we didn't talk to people in the community. We didn't go to the general public. So we talked to state and local officials. We talked to community-based organizations. We talked to education and advocacy groups. We also included some construction and maintenance folks and some consultants in our listening sessions. And it kind of depended on the group and the city and who the key players were. How am I doing on time? Okay. We we asked them a series of questions and we really let the conversation kind of flow. So typically sessions were about an hour and a half. Sometimes they went 2.5 hours. Very rarely were they shorter. We started off asking people, what's green infrastructure like in your community, to kind of get them talking and get their thoughts flowing. What does it look like here? And then we moved into some more pointed questions like, do you think about other things when you're thinking about a green infrastructure installation? Do you think about what are other some of those other criteria, some of those other co-benefits? Is that something you're thinking about, and how do you think about it? We asked about how it's determined where the green infrastructure is installed in a community, to try and get at, is there any prioritization based on infrastructure amenities, or is there any kind of look at equity in terms of where green infrastructure is being installed? We looked at design considerations because we were interested in whether or not there was workforce development potential and what that would look like. And then basically we opened it up for, is there anything else you haven't told us that we might want to hear? So we learned a lot of lessons from this. We had some communities that really had done a lot, and we had communities that were just starting but were interested. So, the takeaways, we kind of identified in terms of communities interested in bringing an equity lens to their green infrastructure projects were, first, to keep it simple. That if you try communities that try to do too much too fast tended to get bogged down. So so not just keeping the green infrastructure planting simple, but keeping the expectations a little bit more simple and building up. Really being thoughtful about it. Um, we also realized that that a lot of times communities are when they talk about green infrastructure are just looking at the stormwater benefits. And so the communities that were really successful were also selling the co-benefits, those societal aspects for green infrastructure that make it maybe more attractive to local government officials, or help local government officials understand what the real scope is of putting in something like green infrastructure, which has maintenance that the city's not familiar with, as opposed to just going with the traditional gray infrastructure. So selling those co-benefits. In terms of workforce development, this was really interesting because you know, green infrastructure has the potential to just be a seasonal job for somebody. And that's really not, when a city is looking at workforce development avenues, they're not in seasonal jobs are fine. But if you're looking at people on the margin, it's better to have green infrastructure career type opportunities. And so communities have done this in a variety of ways, which I don't have time to get into too much, but some of them are, Minneapolis has a green infrastructure incubator program where they train landscape companies to do green infrastructure projects, and then they give them some startup funding to develop this as a career niche. Or this is a picture of the Peoria Green Corps graduation ceremony. So they are training people to do not only green infrastructure jobs, but also to be able to get municipal jobs in the park district or you know, with public works to do some of these kind of maintenance kinds of things. So it's a year-round job as opposed to just something you can do during the growing season. I also found that it was really, really significant and important to look at education at every level. So really reaching out to not just the decision makers and the people in power to make those decisions, but going down to the people in the community. You know, there are, I think Detroit is kind of Detroit had a tree planting program, and they were going to put, you know, beautiful trees in underserved communities. And the people in those communities said, "What are you doing? We don't want help from the government. You know, we don't know what your trees are. Is it going to cause crime? Am I going to have to rake leaves?" And so it was really it taught those of us who are kind of looking at these social science aspects a lot about how to approach communities who have been disenfranchised and who may be leery of people coming in to help. That you really need to engage and find some local community champions if you're putting these green infrastructure installations in communities where we can then leverage the co-benefits and hopefully rise all ships. And then the final thing is the relationships and partnerships. Most of the successful cities who have, all of the successful cities who have coupled their city-based green infrastructure program with an equity program have partnered with an equity-focused nonprofit in that community. And that those relationships are hugely important and require a lot of nurturing. So then we brought together, and I'm just going to go over this quickly, brought everybody together, about 130 people together to talk about, okay, how do we put all this together and what are our priorities? And so in terms of extension priorities for this kind of work, how do we as extension agents help communities build these programs where green infrastructure really supports the community in ways that are not necessarily easy for those small to mid-sized communities to achieve on their own. Funding it always rises to the top as a thing we need. We need more money to build programs and to give programs and to help, you know, fund community efforts to do these kinds of things. We want to formalize an extension Sea Grant community of practice around green infrastructure, but with a particular focus on the co-benefits of green infrastructure. And then we talked about developing extension programming. Again, if funding permitting, we want to develop some tools that we were loosely calling Green Infrastructure 201 for decision makers, which can help talk about the co-benefits, the what does reduced noise pollution do for a community? What does having more green space do for children in those areas? What kind of community cohesion avenues are helpful? We talked about, you know, case studies and fact sheets, I think, are kind of our bread and butter. So we talked about trying to develop some more of those. And we also talked about, you know, we want to make sure to prioritize multilingual programming, particularly if we are working with landscape companies who might be interested in building green infrastructure as one of their services, because a lot of times those landscape companies may not have English as a first language. So multilingual programming came up as a high priority. We also identified some applied research priorities. We need more information about what successful workforce development looks like for green infrastructure. We have some models for the solar industry. Solar has done a lot with job creation. but solar isn't seasonal, and solar isn't necessarily as local as green infrastructure is. So there are some similarities and differences, but still, I think it can provide some good models. But we need more about how to do this, and what are the real the ways communities can be successful. We need better standards on what the co-benefits are of green infrastructure, and what the real economic and societal value is of those. Um, and one of the things with green infrastructure is that that we know what it costs to put a pipe in the ground. There is more uncertainty about what it costs to maintain a green infrastructure installation. Even though studies show that green infrastructure installations typically cost less than gray infrastructure, there's uncertainty. And so we need some more tools and some more ways and models that we can help communities understand what those economic and societal benefits are. We need to look at life cycle cost analysis, from cradle to grave on green infrastructure, and again, be able to show cities what what the full life cycle cost and benefit would be. Um, we also talked about evaluating and standardizing green infrastructure monitoring practices. At least in Illinois, we don't have a great way to measure um, how actually statewide, we don't have a green infrastructure monitoring database. Um, and and so it's hard to look at how long have those things been around, what's their water quality benefit, what's their stormwater benefit, what are those co-benefits. So we kind of need to do some standardizing and evaluating that green infrastructure monitoring. And then finally, I mean, all this feeds into decision support tools for communities, things that we can use as extension agents um, to help communities make decisions appropriately, what they put where and how. Um, I want to again point out the sponsors and the partners on this program. We received funding from North Central Region Water Network and University of Illinois Extension. We partnered with Lake Superior, Parkland College, which is a community college that has a license to run the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program training. Think Big Strategies. It was Carla Walker, who's a consultant out of Cincinnati, Ohio, who specializes in equity and natural resources and helping organizations ensure that their environmental efforts are also equitable. Michigan Sea Grant, South Dakota State University Extension, University of Wisconsin Extension, and Purdue Extension were our partners. So with that, are there questions or comments?
Looks like we have a few.
Okay.
Thanks so much. I can kick things off, Chris, if you want. We have one question already in the chat box. Folks, please use that to communicate your questions with us. If you have a question that is a little more in depth, you can raise your hand and we can actually give you permission to share that. Otherwise, you're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A box. So the first question coming in, Lisa, is just a question about, do you know, are there any other similar studies being done in other regional networks, specifically this person's asking about New England, but I think across the United States?
Not that I know of, but I don't have a lot of colleagues in New England. I work mostly in the Midwest. So, so I don't know of any similar studies. I know that New England is ahead of us in a lot of ways in terms of green infrastructure monitoring and application. So, so I think there's ripe potential, but I don't know of anything specifically happening. There are some. There was a study in New York, now that I've said that, there was a study in New York looking at workforce development and green infrastructure. And so they had funding to train some at-risk high schoolers and give them both green infrastructure skills and job skills, and then, put them out in the world. And they actually showed some really positive benefits, that the kids that got that combination were I think like 82% of them were still employed 3 years after graduation from high school. So there are one-off things, but I don't know of anything region-wide.
That's great, thanks. And I would offer, I know that I'm looking at the list of attendees. I know there are a lot of folks in the room that know a ton about green infrastructure here in Vermont, as well as across New England. So if there is something that you want to share, if there is a project that's similar or something you've heard about, please put it in the chat box for us.
So another question that's here, Beverly Wemple asks, your comments about the city staff being concerned about maintenance costs of green infrastructure were interesting to me. Any additional insights into overcoming this possible barrier to implementation? And then she goes on to say, I've encountered similar concerns when working with small municipalities with limited budgets in Vermont on addressing resilience of rural roads. They want to use green approaches, but worry about costs, maintenance, etc.
Yeah, it's it's a sticky problem, and the that's the solution that we as extension agents came up with is that we need to help educate local government officials on, and have some of those tools, be able to do the math and show that, this is what we can expect. And while there is uncertainty, because this isn't a practice that's been around for hundreds of years, that there are good examples where it not only costs less, but it has these other benefits. So I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I do know, just anecdotally, it seems like more people in local governments are more interested in thinking about some of these, some of these opportunities and some more innovative approaches. And so, some of it, I wonder, is it a generational thing? And as people retire, are people who've grown up with climate change being a reality for them going to think about things differently? And I don't know the answer to that. So that's probably not a very good answer. I don't know what the solution is, other than trying to do more education and have more tools to help local government officials kind of understand what they're getting into. Another thing that I don't think I mentioned that we talked about was that it's hard because there's not a lot of standardization across practices. We looked statewide and there were loose goals, but there wasn't, there weren't like, do this and these are the benefits you're going to get. And so that I think would help kind of appease that fear that, and I get it. If you're in charge of maintaining something that you don't have any expertise in, and there's not really a budget for it, it's hard to take on. So.
Beverly also had added my question. P.S. My question has some equity implications too, since these small rural communities tend to be at an economic disadvantage relative to larger population centers. So that's touching upon what you said.
Yeah. That's a hard one, but that's why there's more work to be done, I guess.
Indeed.
Definitely. So our next question in the queue here is coming from Heather Boyson. Heather is asking, how would you reconcile a desire to add green infrastructure features if there's projects that are already being advanced that are transportation improvements?
Oh, I assume this is in terms of the unintended consequences of green infrastructure. So Gary, Indiana is a town that is, so it's in Indiana. It's just across the border from Chicago, or from the Chicago hinterlands. And it's an old industrial town and has really suffered a lot of economic disadvantage as big steel companies have gone out of business and all of that. And so I kind of asked them that because they're doing a ton with green infrastructure. And I said, do you have any concern about displacing people? And they basically said, no, that we need all the help we can get. So I think sometimes communities need the property values to go up, and so they want that, and that they're not so worried about displacing people because people are leaving at such a high rate. So I don't know that I have a great answer, but Atlanta might be a good place to look. So they built a trail beltway around the city, and they had a whole plan in place to make sure that gentrification didn't occur, and that that they were really taking into consideration any unintended consequences of this project. And it didn't work. The speculative real estate still came in, and the housing prices still went up, and people were still displaced. But they have gone on to do a lot of work in this area, so they might have some. And I'm not up to date on the latest of where they are, but that might be a place to look and just kind of see how they have adapted to make sure that that trailway system did not continue to exacerbate the problem.
So our next question is from Sarah Wasserman. She says, hi there. I know it's a huge piece of policy, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the Green New Deal in terms of any potential it might show to being helpful to increase positive green infrastructure in communities.
I hope that we continue to see things like the Green New Deal, and I hope that I'm trying not to be political, but I hope that that the next administration's interest in climate, and appointing a climate ambassador, that helps us really start to have a real conversation of what these kinds of programs and policies can have, what impact they can have on the ground. I know in Illinois, there's rumblings, not just Illinois, but around the Midwest. We are slated to benefit from climate change in ways, and good or bad. So there's discussion of, like, how do we create policies that that make our states attractive for people who are being displaced, potentially from Florida or along Gulf Coast states, to appreciate Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, in ways that they might not otherwise appreciate. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe we're turning a corner in this area. I think there's a lot of potential to really, to use green infrastructure to solve a lot of issues that that we're facing.
So I'm just going to point out, we can do two things. There's about 4 questions still in the Q&A, and we have about 2 minutes. So we can do like a speed round of 30-second answer per question, or we can also try to answer some afterwards if you would be open to that, if we don't get to all of them in the next couple of minutes.
I'm okay time-wise, so okay. Whichever you want to do is fine with me.
Okay, well, let's move forward and see how it goes. Ashley, you want to field?
Yep, sure thing. So question coming in from Stephanie Hurley. She says, thanks, Lisa. I enjoyed your presentation. I'm wondering if there are different strategies and or circumstances that you might highlight for regulatory versus non-regulatory green software infrastructure. So she's saying potentially making a distinction between comparing private versus public land installations.
That is a good question. And I don't know that I have a really informed answer for that. There was a paper that I read, and I'm not sure I can remember the specifics of it well enough, that we're looking at funding of green infrastructure and, the percentage of public funding and private funding. I know in Illinois, related to, we deal a lot with nutrient loss reduction because the nitrogen and phosphorus go down the Mississippi River. So we're a chief contributor to Gulf hypoxia, and we are required to deal with that. And I know in our state, we have put a premium on non-regulatory solutions, and really, I have to say kudos to the ag industry, because they've really stepped up and kind of pushed this so that we can stay away from the regulatory solutions. but I don't know that I have a good answer for how, how this comes about in terms of green infrastructure. But good question.
All right. The next question is from Alan Strong. It seems like there's a lot of ways to do a not so great job in integrating equity into green infrastructure projects. Do you have any advice as to make sure you get started with a strong foundation?
I think there are many really good examples around the country. I think looking at Seattle is a great place to start. Minneapolis, Milwaukee. And then in Illinois, if you're looking for a mid-sized city, Peoria, Illinois has done a really excellent job. They were under an EPA consent decree for their combined sewer overflow, and they chose to, at least initially, try to solve their issues 100% with green infrastructure. And so they've done a ton. So for a more mid-sized city. So I guess my thought is that starting, talking to some of those people who've kind of been down this path is a really a good place to start. And in our experience with the listening sessions, people were so open and so willing to talk about what their successes were and what their failures were, because those more advanced programs, we did kind of talk about what didn't work. So I guess that would be my first place to start. There's also what is it called? The Green Infrastructure Leadership Network, I believe, which is a network of communities. So it's and I think it's a membership network, but it's communities who are implementing green infrastructure, and they also have some equity. Equity is not their focus. Green infrastructure is their focus, but it's in our conversations with them, they've got a nice group of people and folks who can kind of talk about what's worked and what hasn't. So that might be another place to look.
Well, Chris, it looks like there's still a few questions in the Q&A as well as a few questions in the chat box. I wonder if it would be best to compile, maybe Lisa will get some of your thoughts on these questions. We can send them out in the follow-up with this session. I know folks have to be, it's 5:03, so I don't want to keep folks too long past 5.
That sounds fine to me. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for attending. Chris, do you have any follow-up tidbits?
Only that, again, if you are interested in a certificate, let us know either by email or in the chat here before you drop off the call. And as Ashley just said, we'll send a follow-up. We will also be sending a follow-up evaluation for the whole semester worth of presenters that we'll ask for people's feedback on. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention today. And thank you, Lisa, for taking time to share your knowledge with us. It's really, you can tell the questions are in depth, and everybody's, it's an important topic that we need to think more about. And so I appreciate your time to put that together and everybody's time for thoughtful questions and attention to the presentation.
Thanks so much.
And